I really could listen to that all night. And as Rabbi Shlomo Katz says, let that melody take me to another place. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It's a lovely Sunday night. Congratulations to Tom Brady and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. The Super Bowl is over. It's time to do some super learning. I've got something special for us tonight. Let's light up the darkness. That melody, that nigun, an old one of Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach, as Shlomo Katz tells us, is called the Rova Chuppah Nigun. Who's with us as we get it going on a Sunday night? James in Indianapolis, Melissa in Great Neck, Marjorie in Georgia, Paula in Chicago, Paul in Minneapolis, Michael in Scranton, Renee in Indy, Loretta and Harold in Oregon. Bill says happy 400th, everyone. Chaim Burke, bad Super Bowl. Let's do some learning. Amen. Chris Castile, shalom from Louisiana. Nancy, let's celebrate Lucy. Shalom from freezing Minnesota. Chris says he really appreciates the lessons. Miriam is in New York City. Samantha says shalom, everyone. Laura in Oregon. Nicholas in Portland, Oregon. Fantastic to be with you. Lynn in North Texas. And I'm not sure what the name is. S. German MD, perhaps? Dr. German? Greetings from a snowy West Hartford. It's Spencer. Hello, Spencer. Okay, welcome everybody. All right, so we're on Daf Ayin Ches, page 78 of Tractate Pesachim, and we're going to be doing the fourth Mishna here in chapter 7. We'll get to that in a moment. We are celebrating our 400th episode of Accidental Talmudist Daily, AT Daily. It's definitely a milestone, an important milestone. What does 400 make us think of? It's really entering a new era, right? I mean, Abraham was told that his descendants would be enslaved 400 years in Egypt. And then later it was kind of adjusted that it would be 400 years from when he was told, and the slavery was shortened to about 210 years. But this idea of 400, it was 400 years, the first segment of Jewish history, from Abraham receiving the call till we left Egypt, on the wings of eagles from God sending us out with a strong hand and an outstretched arm and bringing us to Sinai and giving us and the whole world the Torah, right? Revealing the Torah. The Torah, our sages teach, pre-existed the universe, right? So it was like the universe was a place where the Torah could be fulfilled. And that means that the commandment, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy resources, pre-existed the creation of the universe. It was waiting for us. That, of course, is the first line of the commandments, which follow that single line that we started to talk about last night, the Shema. The Shema. And if you missed last night's show, definitely you want to catch that one, episode number 399, because I spoke about this experience that I had with the Shema Prayer, right? A Jew is commanded to say that at least twice a day. More often we say more than that. We would say in the morning prayers, in the evening prayers, and then there's the bedtime Shema as well. And we pray that we'll, be of whole mind enough and have the opportunity that as we leave this world at our death, that this would be the final words on our lips. What does this mean? So this is from Deuteronomy 6:4. And here it is. I mean, here are the words. This is the Art Scroll Interlinear Chumash. So right down there, let me see if I can do this backwards without looking, right? So that there is Shema. Whoa, right there. Shema. This is backwards for me, that's my confusion. But that is Shema Yisrael. Then the name of God, the four-letter name of God that we don't pronounce, we'll substitute Adonai when we're teaching or praying. Normally we'll say Hashem. That's another name of God where we say our God. Then the four-letter name of God again, and then one. God is one. But what's interesting, and the reason I'm showing you these words, is you see, and this recreates what is written in the Torah, you see that the ayin at the end of the first word, Shema, is enlarged. And so is the dalet at the end of this line, right there, at the end of echad, which means one. So the ayin and the dalet are enlarged, and that is something that a sofer, one who, all Torah scrolls are of course written by hand by a qualified scribe, and that enlarged ayin at the end of Shema and dalet at the end of echad are required for a kosher Torah. I mean, for the Torah to be written properly, those letters need to be enlarged. It's tradition that goes all the way back to Mount Sinai. Why are those two letters enlarged? Well, if you put them together, ayin daled spells ed, witness, witness. So embedded, encoded, as it were, in these words, hear Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, or the Lord our God, the Lord is one, is this idea of witnessing, ed, be a witness. So it's not just something we say. That's the key here. It's not something you say. Somebody who witnesses a phenomena, who witnesses an event, who witnesses a joy or a crime or any incident, experiences that incident, right? If you witness it, it's like you were there. You experienced it. So we're being commanded to experience God's oneness. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more. And then here at our 400th episode, as we enter perhaps a new era of AT Daily, after I talk a little bit more about the Shema, how we say it, what it means, so we're going to say it together. We're going to close our eyes and we're going to say it together. We're going to do a little praying together. I mean, I'm almost thinking like, why haven't we prayed together before? We pray for healing for people. We do that often. But let's pray together. Let's have a moment of prayer. And the Shema, you know, I recently heard a teaching that every Jew, at least, perhaps every person, should have a commandment that is particular. It's a lesson in the Talmud, actually, everyone should have at least one of the commandments that they're particularly attached to, that is especially dear to them, is the way that it's put by our sages. And I think I would have to say that the Shema is mine. This is a commandment. The commandment to say Shema is a commandment that is very dear to me. And this idea of not just saying it, but experiencing it is especially dear to me. So, a few more thoughts about this. I have a feeling that we're going to start doing this, say Shema together, and I'll try. And it's a sort of line, just 6 words. I believe we could find something new to say about the Shema every day for the rest of our lives. So here's what I'll say today. First of all, when it says Shema Yisrael, right? So it's not just, hey, listen, nation of Israel, this kind of general command to the whole nation. It is that, absolutely. But it is also particular to you, right? I mean, if you're a Jew and you identify yourself as one of the nation of Israel, well, it's very interesting. It's a name of a nation, but we are the children of Israel because we're the descendants of the 12 tribes who are the 12 sons of Jacob, whom God renamed Israel. God said, your name shall be Israel. So Israel is both the name of a nation and it's the name of a person. And when God says Shema Yisrael, he's saying, listen, you, right? You descendant of Israel, you child of God, you person who loves and is in awe of God. It's a very particular command. we should feel that we're in connection and in relationship with God when we say these words. Now, what follows? Rambam, the Maimonides, right? The Rambam, Moses Maimonides, one of the greatest commentators on scripture and Jewish history, and also a great scientist and medical doctor, and whose Mishna Torah, the codification of all the law and all of scripture, is incredibly authoritative in Jewish thought and in Jewish history. One of the things that he did is he wrote the Sefer HaMitzvahs. So he sort of codified all the laws, right? And said, these are the 613 laws which are written in the Torah. And he ordered them a little bit in terms of priority. The most important commands first. What are the first 3 commandments? And they all occur right here in Deuteronomy. Right, Deuteronomy 6:4 is the line, the Shema. Right before that is the 10 Commandments, right? The 10 Commandments are stated in the Torah portion of last week in Yisro, and then they're stated again in Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Torah. And so they're the 10 Commandments. And the first commandment is, I am the Lord your God. Meaning that the first commandment is believe in God. Right? Believe that God exists, that God created the world, and that God issued commands. And that any commands that come down to us through the Torah come from the creator of the world. That's the first commandment, is to understand that there is a God, God created the world, and God issues commands. The second commandment is that God is the one and only. There is only one God. We are monotheists. And so the second commandment is to understand that God is one. Where do we get that God is one? From the Shema. Hear, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And what is the third commandment, according to Rambam, that is the highest priority for us? To love God. Right? And that is the very next line. After we say Shema, then it says Ve'ahavta. That's the very next page. Right? So Deuteronomy 6:5, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your resources. Says Rashi, what does it mean to love God? What does it mean to love God? First of all, a servant who obeys his or her master out of fear, it's considered an inferior relationship to a servant who obeys his or her master out of love. Because one who only obeys out of fear, when situation changes, that servant will wander off. But one who loves the master out of one who loves, if the situation changes, if his fortune goes from bad to worse, from good to better, things change, he'll still love. She will still love. So we're commanded to love, and how do we express that love? By doing what God asks of us lovingly. Right? We're eager to serve. We're eager to submit. We're eager to do what God asks of us. That is how Rashi says we love God. I would add, just as spouses or any romantic couple express their love of each other, and parents and children as well, and relatives and friends. When you really love someone, what's one of the obvious things that you do? You say, I love you. You tell the object of your love that you love them. So if God commands us to love, and we're always trying to kind of incubate love in our hearts for the Holy One, which is not obvious or easy since God is silent in this world. God hides in this world so that we have a choice and a free will whether we will love or not, whether we will obey commands or not. God doesn't overwhelm us with God's presence. So we have to cultivate that love in our hearts. And I would say that a great way to do that is to say to God, I love you, and to make a regular practice of that. Okay, so with those few thoughts as background, I'll return to yesterday's idea, and I did it this morning. So when I'm about to say Shema, the first thing I'm going to say is Shema, which means hear or listen, right? So maybe since I'm going to fulfill the commandment to listen, I shouldn't just jump right in and go yakety yak with my mouth. How about I sit still for a moment and I listen to what's happening in my environment. Wherever your environment is, when you're about to say Shema, take a moment to listen to your environment, because whatever you hear is the Lord, right? The world has, in fact, the whole universe has a background noise. Physicists will tell us that there is this small amount of noise that's left over from the Big Bang, right? So there is always noise, even in deep space. What is that noise? It's the noise of God's creation. It's what God chose to have happening right around us right now. So to really plug into God's creation and my place in it, so I can sort of remember that I'm a soul who came into this world to fulfill a mission, start by just grounding oneself in the here and now, listen to the here and now. And then what I discovered Friday night, right, is maybe even try not just to hear what's immediately here in the natural world, but these words, Shema Yisrael, and then the 4 letters of God's name, which we don't say or pronounce. When I try to hear them, in my mind's eye, I see them, the Yud, the He, the Vav, the He. Our God, Eloheinu, the 4-letter name, and then Echad. So let's do that together. Shema Yisroel Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Welcome back. All right. Let's do a little learning. We are holding here in chapter 7 of Tractate Pesachim, the 4th volume of the Talmud, the laws of Passover. We're in the second half of this tractate. We're studying the laws of the Pesach, the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering, the Paschal lamb or goat. Here we are in chapter 7, and we're doing the 4th Mishnah tonight. And here we are discussing, sort of how to handle problems that come up when one is bringing the Passover offering. Of course, the Passover offering can only be brought when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. We haven't brought it in 2,000 years almost, but we study its laws as a substitute for bringing the Korban Pesach. Okay, here we go. The 4th Mishnah, here on Daf Ayin Ches, page 78 in Tractate Pesachim. The Mishnah: if the meat of the Paschal lamb became tameh, ritually impure, and the fat remains pure and may be burned on the altar, one may not sprinkle the blood. To explain that line, we're going to bring the Paschal offering. And it's unlike other offerings in that its primary the primary aspect of the Passover offering is not what goes up on the altar, just a very small part of it. Its fats are burned on the altar in the temple. A bit of its blood is sprinkled on the altar, but the vast majority of the offering comes back out of the temple courtyard and then returns to the group of people who are registered to it in order to eat it on the 15th of Nisan, right? The 15th is when we celebrate Passover. That night is the 15th, the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan. We slaughter it that night. We eat it when the temple is standing. So if the meat became impure, so meaning at some point in this process, perhaps, and it's the meat that we're talking about rather than the offering, meaning after it was slaughtered, then it became meat as opposed to an animal, and something happened. It came into contact with a tameh person. He shouldn't have been in the courtyard if he's tameh, if he's ritually impure. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe he only found out while he was there. Maybe, God forbid, somebody died in the courtyard on Passover and people had to attend to his burial, and then they touched the meat, etc. Somehow the meat became tameh. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? And the fat remains pure, right? So the fat was already separated, this little bit of the lamb, which is going to be offered up on the altar. Offered up meaning it's going to be burned in the pyre, the fire that's on top of the altar for burning offerings. So the fat remains pure, and so it may be burned on the altar, but then one may not sprinkle the blood. On the other hand, if the fat became impure, but the meat remains pure, then one may sprinkle the blood on the altar because the meat remains fit to be eaten. This is the law with regard to a paschal lamb whose primary purpose is to be eaten by those who have registered for it. However, with regard to other offerings, it is not so. Rather, although the meat has become impure and the fat remains pure, one may sprinkle the blood because part of the offering still remains valid. So, for example, if we were talking about the festival offering, the Chagiga, which is brought on the day of the 15th or at some point during the festival of Passover, so then it's a little bit different, right? Then what really is important about it as an offering is not so much the eating of it, but the fact that a little part of it goes up and is burned on the altar and that some of its blood is sprinkled. That is when that offering is deemed to be accepted, right? That when you bring a sin offering or a guilt offering, when you're bringing an offering as an atonement for a transgression, right? It's not the eating that is important. It's the fact that some of it is burned on the altar. It's the fact that blood is sprinkled on the altar. So there's going to be different consequences for the meat or for the fats becoming impure when one is pure and the other is impure. Now we go to the Gemara, the commentary on this. Rav Giddel said that Rav said, if one sprinkled the blood, despite the fact that the meat was ritually impure, it was nonetheless accepted because one is not obligated, and one is not obligated to observe Pesach Sheni. Meaning, if you were not able to complete the Passover offering, to fulfill your obligation to bring the Passover offering, perhaps because you were in a state of impurity, then you'd be obligated to come back a month later on Pesach Sheni, the second Pesach, the second Passover, which is 1 month later, and then you have that second opportunity to bring the Pesach to make up for the fact that you were impure or otherwise unqualified, or you were too far away, or you were ill and weren't able to eat. There's a second chance to participate in this mitzvah. So what Rav seems to be saying is, well, you're not supposed to do this. You're not supposed to sprinkle the blood if the meat became impure. But if you did, perhaps because you didn't know that the meat became impure, you made a mistake, then retroactively it's still going to be deemed valid. So this is one of those cases where the rabbis will make, this is not going to be, by the way, the law. This is Rav's opinion. But in his opinion, it would seem that ab initio, as in the first place, you shouldn't do that. But if you did do that, it's not such a transgression that the whole procedure becomes invalid. The Gemara asks, don't we require that the paschal lamb be eaten? Which could not occur in this case because the meat became ritually impure, became disqualified for eating. The Gemara answers, failure to engage in eating the offering does not preclude it from being accepted. This is going to be a matter of dispute. The Gemara asks, isn't it written, and if the household be too little, so this is now we're reading Exodus 12:14, and if the household be too little for a lamb, then he and his neighbor who is close to his house shall take one according to the number of souls. According to every man's eating, you shall make your count for the lamb. So here we have two commandments in that verse. One, that all these people have to be counted. That's what it means, that the group of people is registered on that lamb. And second, that they have to eat it, right? That they have to be able, qualified, ready to eat the lamb, because that's its purpose. You slaughter it in the temple, you put a little bit of blood on the altar, you burn a little bit of its fats up on the altar, but the main purpose of the Paschal lamb is that it should be eaten. So if it's not gonna be eaten by anybody, then that never should have been slaughtered in the first place. So the verse, but now in this Mishnah, in the discussion of this Mishnah, we get a new understanding of this verse. This indicates that the Torah requires one to eat the Paschal lamb. But the Gemara responds, this verse is stated as a mitzvah only. It should be fulfilled, but it does not preclude the acceptance of the offering. The Gemara asks, and was it not stated to preclude acceptance of the offering if it cannot be eaten? It would seem that the way it's stated and what we've been learning so far is, well, if it can't be eaten, then, then it shouldn't have been slaughtered. And if it was slaughtered for people who can't eat it, it's disqualified. So how can you say that it might be accepted anyway, where they didn't do the eating and it shouldn't have been slaughtered anyway, at least if they knew? Wasn't it taught in a baraisa? According to the number of souls. This teaches that the Paschal lamb is slaughtered only for those who have registered for it and have thereby included themselves in advance in the number of souls. I might have thought that if one slaughtered it for those who have not registered for it, he is merely like one who violates a mitzvah, but the offering is still valid after the fact. Therefore, the verse states, according to every man's eating, you shall make your count. The verse repeated that the Paschal lamb is eaten only by those registered in order to underscore that failure to register precludes the offering from being valid. So if it's not valid, how could we say that it's accepted by the Holy One, that the people fulfill their obligation? According to that baraisa. And those who are able to eat the offering, as opposed to the sick or the elderly who may be unable to eat it, right? When we talk about the sick or the elderly in this context, it's people that for one reason or another, they just can't eat. They can't eat meat, or they can't eat that meat, or they can't eat at all. So if they can be included in a group as long as the group includes people who can eat the offering. But if all the people are in that situation, that they're ill or they're elderly or for some reason they can't eat, then as we've seen before, it would be an invalid slaughtering of the Paschal offering, because it has to be for a group that can eat it. It can include people that can't eat it, but the group must include people that can eat it. And those who are able to eat the offering, as opposed to the sick or the elderly who are unable to eat it, are juxtaposed in this verse to those who are registered. Therefore, just as a Paschal lamb is disqualified if it is slaughtered for those who did not register for it, it is also disqualified if it cannot be eaten. This poses a difficulty for the opinion of Rav, who said that if one sprinkled the blood, despite the fact that it can't be eaten, it is nevertheless accepted. It's not what we should do, but if he did it, it's going to cause the offering to be accepted. That's according to Rav. But this baraisa seems to challenge him. It says it needs to be for a group of people who are registered on it and who can eat it. So if you sprinkled blood for something, and now if the meat became disqualified, so now no one can eat it. They're not allowed to eat it if the meat became tameh and therefore disqualified. So how can you say that this offering is going to be accepted? What does sprinkling the blood change the fact that, as we've seen before, if you slaughter for people who can't eat it, and in this case you slaughtered, then it became tameh, so now no one can eat it. How is it possibly going to be accepted? The Gemara answers. Rather, so the Gemara is going to change tack a little bit. Rather, Rav said his statement in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Natan, or let's say Rabbi Noson. Rabbi Noson said that failure to engage in eating the Paschal lamb does not preclude one from fulfilling one's obligation to bring the offering as the eating is a separate mitzvah. So we'll see that Rabbi Noson has a dispute with the rabbis. They say, no, in order to fulfill this mitzvah, in order for a person to have fulfilled his obligation, he's got to eat from it, or at least be part of a group that some of them are going to eat from it. But if no one can eat from it, how can we possibly say that anyone has fulfilled his obligation? That's the rabbi's position. But Rabbi Noson says, no, you can. Even if you don't eat, there is a possibility of fulfilling your obligation. How is this? Okay, so Rabbi Noson said that the failure to engage in eating the Paschal lamb does not preclude one from fulfilling one's obligation to bring the offering, as the eating is a separate commandment. So according to Rabbi Noson, right, you bring it. That means that you bring it to the temple and you slaughter it. You put the fats and the blood is sprinkled, and then eating it is another mitzvah. You're also obligated to eat it. But even if you weren't able to eat it, you could have fulfilled your obligation to bring it. That's what Rabbi Noson says. So the Gemara asks, which statement of Rabbi Noson is this referring to? If we say it is this statement, which we're about to read, as it was taught in a Baraisa, that Rabbi Noson says, from where is it derived that all Jews may fulfill their obligation after the fact with one Paschal lamb, right? So Rabbi Noson is suggesting this is not what we want to do at all. But if there was a very particular situation, and he's going to explain what the circumstances are, under these circumstances, it would be possible for the entire Jewish people to fulfill their obligation to bring the Passover lamb with just one lamb for the entire people. How is this possible? From where is it derived that all Jews may fulfill their obligation after the fact with one Paschal lamb? The verse states, Exodus 12:6, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall slaughter it in the afternoon. He asked, and does the entire assembly slaughter it? Is it a mitzvah for each individual to slaughter his own Paschal lamb? No, we've seen already that a group registers on the lamb, and then one of its members walks inside the temple and goes through the procedure of slaughtering it, and a priest receiving the blood and walking it to the altar, etc. Just one of the group goes in. So is it a mitzvah for each individual to slaughter his own Paschal lamb? Is it not true that only one person slaughters on behalf of the entire group? Rather, this formulation of the verse teaches that all Jews may fulfill their obligation with one Paschal lamb. It is considered as though they all slaughtered it and fulfilled their obligation, even though they cannot all eat one olive-sized portion, which is the minimum amount that you have to eat in order to fulfill your obligation to eat the Passover lamb. Right? So if there was one lamb for the whole Jewish people, obviously not everybody can get one olive-sized portion of the one lamb. So not everybody will be able to fulfill their obligation to eat of the lamb. But according to Rabbi Noson, everyone will be able to fulfill their obligation to bring it, right? If this one person who slaughtered it, I guess, had in mind to bring it on behalf of everybody, how could this work? The Gemara responds that this is not comparable to the case at hand. Perhaps it is different there, as what Rabbi Noson was talking about is that if these withdraw from the offering, it is fit for those. And if those withdraw, it is fit for these. In other words, although it is impossible for all Jews to partake of this one lamb, the offering is fit for each individual who could eat an olive bulk of it if enough other people would withdraw. So you might have a situation where there's a group that wanted to be registered on a lamb, and perhaps their lamb got lost and it was too late for them to get a new lamb and register for it. So then what they might do, I guess, is put themselves in a backup position on another lamb. They would go to another group and they say, we lost our lamb. This group has a lamb. So you guys are all registered on it. We would like to register as the backups to your group. And that if something should happen to the people in your group, if you should all become, or some of you, enough of you, should become tameh after it's slaughtered and you won't be able to eat it, we'd like the one who slaughters to have in mind that if you guys withdraw from your lamb, we're ready to step in and become the new registered group, right? The pre-registered, but the sort of substitute, replacements, the second string, the bench of it, as it were, registered to that lamb. And so in that way, you could have like a, first string, second string, third string, fourth string. It's like the whole nation could line up so that even though obviously it's never going to happen that every group somehow becomes disqualified ahead of the next group, nevertheless, technically speaking, they could all be in line and every individual is fit to eat the lamb if somehow all the other ones ahead of him in line would become disqualified. Rather, so is that what Rabbi Noson, is that what Rav is pointing to as Rabbi Noson's teaching, that he is saying that the law is according to Rabbi Noson? Rather, or perhaps, the Gemara is not saying rather, it is this other statement of Rabbi Noson, as it was taught in a Baraisa. So it's a different teaching of Rabbi Noson. If one group registered for a Paschal lamb, and then another group registered for it, and there was not enough meat to allow each person to eat an olive bulk, the first ones who have an olive bulk of the Paschal lamb for each person, they eat, and they are exempt from performing the ritual of the Paschal lamb on the second Pesach, because they did it. They fulfilled their obligation at Passover. They came, they brought, they were registered, it was slaughtered, it came out, they cooked it, they all remained fit, the meat remained fit, they each ate an olive-sized portion of it, they fulfilled their obligation. This other group who was waiting on the bench, sort of the second stringers, they didn't have their own lamb, they were in the second position on this lamb, it never came to them, so even though they were registered for it, they never got to eat. Now, in this other teaching of Rabbi Noson, it says the first group has fulfilled their obligation. They don't have to do anything on the second Passover, Pesach Sheni, 1 month from now. But the latter ones, the second group, who do not have an olive bulk available from the Paschal lamb for each person, they do not eat, and they are obligated to perform the ritual of the Paschal lamb on the second Pesach. That's what the Baraisa says. But Rabbi Noson, who is taking the minority view in this other teaching, Rabbi Noson says, both these and those are exempt from performing the ritual of the Paschal lamb on the second Pesach, as the blood has already been sprinkled. Therefore, they have all fulfilled their obligation. This indicates that according to the opinion of Rabbi Noson, eating is not essential. So according to Rabbi Noson, this second group who got there in that second position, the backup position, and say, well, if in case you guys become disqualified, we'll eat. We understand that, you're the first group, it's your lamb. If you guys remain qualified and then you eat and there's not enough to give us, okay, then we won't eat. But we are in that second position on this particular lamb. And so that second group is registered to that lamb. And so even though they didn't get to eat of it, the fact is it was slaughtered properly. It was slaughtered in a qualified manner for a qualified group. And then its blood was sprinkled on the altar. And that second group, even though they didn't get to eat from it, they were part of the group. And according to Rabbi Noson, they fulfilled their obligation. According to the rabbis who dispute Rabbi Noson, they did not. So here we're examining Rabbi Noson's position. It seems that Rav agrees with Rabbi Noson. The Gemara responds that one can still ask. Perhaps it is different there. As if these members of the first group withdraw, it is fit for the members of the second group. The Gemara rejects the question. If so, let it teach that the second group is exempt from the second Passover, since the members of the first group are fit to withdraw. What is the reason for the statement of the Baraisa that the blood has already been sprinkled? Learn from this that the matter depends on the blood, but failure to engage in eating the Paschal lamb does not preclude one from fulfilling his obligation. Okay. All right, so I'm going to stop there. And then but before I go to questions and comments, so I want to read to you what the halacha is, where the law came out on this question. So here's the halacha. A Paschal lamb that became ritually impure. If the sacrificial portions of the Paschal lamb become impure and the meat remains pure, the blood is sprinkled and the meat is eaten. The blood is sprinkled on the altar, and the meat which remained pure is eaten by the group of people who were registered to it. If the meat, so after the slaughter, if the meat became impure, became tameh, then even if the fat, the part that's going to be burned on the altar, even if that remained pure, the blood may not be sprinkled on the altar. If the blood is sprinkled, the offering is not accepted even after the fact. So the law is not like Rav on this. The law is not like Rabbi Noson. However, if one did not know that the meat became impure before the sprinkling, and he unwittingly sprinkled the blood, this is what the rabbis called because he was permitted, right? There was a group of people, they were registered on the lamb. Everybody was fit to eat the lamb, or at least a portion of the people were fit to eat the lamb. He took the lamb inside the temple. It was slaughtered properly. And then unbeknownst to him, something happened to the meat, but he didn't know that. Something happened to the meat, so he was watching as the priest received a little bit of the blood in the vessel that we talked about, and then it goes up the chain like a bucket brigade, up the line of priests, and they sprinkle some of the blood on the altar, and they burn some of the fats on the altar, and then he looks back at the meat, and he's like, oh my gosh, it came into contact. Let's say there was a dead creeping thing that no one saw there before, like a dead mouse or something, one of the sheritzim that disqualified, that impart tuma. Then he says, oh my gosh, the meat became impure. So if he had seen that the meat became tameh, he would not have been allowed to sprinkle the blood. But since he didn't notice, he didn't know that the meat became impure, and he sprinkled the blood in the meantime, so that is going to be allowed. That's going to be an exception because of his innocence to the fact that the meat had become impure. The Rambam, who we mentioned at the beginning of the show, ruled in accordance with the Mishna and in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis in their dispute with Rabbi Noson. Although Rav explained that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Noson, since the rabbis disagreed with him, the halacha accepts their opinion. In addition, the Gemara indicates that this explanation was forced. The fact is that the Mishnah does not accord with the opinion of Rabbi Noson, and somehow Rav was pushing it, and they didn't accept the way that Rav pushed it. So although the Gemara later states that according to the opinion of Rav, the Mishnah rules in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua, the majority of the rabbis dispute Rabbi Yehoshua's opinion in this matter, and the law is as we have just stated. But with regard to other offerings, the law is if the meat of an offering other than the Paschal lamb becomes ritually impure, but the fat remains pure, or if the fat becomes ritually impure and the meat remains pure, then in either case, the blood may be sprinkled. As long as either the meat or the fats remain in a state of purity, the blood can be sprinkled. And it's the blood being sprinkled that really affects the atonement. And that is the active portion of bringing an offering, even if it's a kind of offering that part of it is eaten. Even if you never get around to eating it, it will affect an atonement for you. But the Paschal lamb is different because its primary purpose is to be eaten. So if it can't be eaten, the blood should not even be sprinkled. If it was sprinkled by a person who knew that the meat was impure, the offering is not accepted. The only exception is if the meat became impure and the person didn't know, and he innocently sprinkled the blood on the altar, then apparently that the offering is deemed to be accepted. All right, let's look at your comments and questions. Here on Daf Ayin Hes, page 78. Sharon Frant Brooks says, when using sign language, hear or listen, it is signed as hear/listen and pay attention. It makes the prayer more relevant for the deaf. Oh, I don't know any sign language, except I recently learned, is this I love you? I think this is I love you, right? I believe that's I love you. But I like that, Sharon. Thank you. So hear and listen are both signed as hear, listen, and pay attention, right? It's not just be passive. It's be actively paying attention. That's what I hear you saying. Sharon also says it is significant to emphasize the final sound of echad, duh, right? So when we say the Shema, you can't just kind of trail off, right? You have to finish it, right? And so like when I normally, when COVID is not raging, and I daven every day in a shul nearby, and Rabbi Rubin, I find myself saying Shema with him in his rhythm, who has a wonderful, deep, gravelly, he's a Hasidic rabbi with just a great, great voice. And his echad, he definitely stretches it out. Echad, right? And one thing you'll notice when I said the prayer is I definitely separated between the words. We actually had that not so many pages ago here in Tractate Pesachim, that it was considered an inappropriate way to say the Shema, that they bundled the words, meaning that they didn't have pauses between the words. You have to enunciate each one. But Sharon is saying particularly you want to emphasize the final sound of the D of Echad to distinguish it from Acher. I guess Acher means other, like that was the nickname of the sage who went rogue. Elisha ben Abuye. So I think what you're saying is if you don't emphasize that D at the end of Echad, it might sound like Acher, which means other, and it might mean, it might suggest that a person has his mind on the fact that, there's more than one God. There's an understanding that in ancient times, because God relates to us in different ways, sometimes God is angry with us, sometimes God is loving with us, sometimes God rewards us, sometimes God punishes us, sometimes God ignores us, sometimes God pays close attention and sends us messages that we can't miss, etc. So the pagans thought that those were like different gods that they were interacting with. But of course, it was, it comes to us from Abraham and the whole monotheistic tradition that we understand that God is an emotional being. We know that because the Torah tells us. We don't really understand God's emotions, but God wrote in the Torah that God can be pleased and that God can become angry. And that those are just different channels through which God relates to us and we can relate to God. Lucy, thank you for praying the Shema with us. And that's what I've got for us tonight. Okay, my friends, it's been great learning with you on this Sunday evening and praying with you. And maybe we'll make that a thing, to learn something about the Shema and to say it at the beginning of class. Who knows? Maybe it'll be every time, maybe not. Let's see what happens. But I certainly enjoy doing it with you. All the best.